one of these two cars is the best everyday hot hatch you can buy right now. That word everyday is important because there are plenty of other hot hatches that are more thrilling to drive or that are faster on circuit. But if you want a hot hatch with bundles of power, the security of four-wheel drive, and that's effortless to use every day, it has to be either the VW Golf R or the Mercedes-AMG A35. We're in soggy Wales. Let's find out which one it is. The Golf R has been the definitive everyday hot hatch since it arrived in 2014. It's the consummate all-rounder, brilliant to drive, effortless to live with, and built to a very high standard. It does it all. But later this year, the new Mark 8 Golf will arrive, and this current version will quickly become yesterday's news. Nonetheless, for now, the Golf R is still the car the new Mercedes-AMG A35 has got to prove itself against. On paper, you can hardly separate the two cars. They have pretty much the same power and torque, 300 horsepower and 295 pound-foot. They have very similar 2-litre turbo engines, similar front-biased four-wheel drive systems, similar dual-clutch transmissions. They both cost near enough £35,000 before option as well, and they have more or less the same performance, 0 to 62 in a fraction under 5 seconds, and top speeds of 155 miles per hour. Clearly, the only way we're going to separate these two cars is to get them out on the road and drive them back to back. Well, this is June in the United Kingdom. It's really wet. It's just about 10 degrees Celsius in the middle of June. Lovely. But at least it demonstrates exactly why cars like this Golf R and that A35 AMG are so effective. With four-wheel drive, they just make so much sense in this country. In wet conditions like this, they just don't seem to lose any of their performance. Now, we're starting with the Golf because, well, it's the incumbent. It's been the class leader since it arrived 5 or so years ago. The archetypal four-wheel drive grown-up hot hatch. I really like this car. I ran one for a year. I did close to 20,000 miles in it. And as a tool for everyday use and for hammering along B roads when you get the opportunity, it's hard to beat. So we'll start with the Golf and remind ourselves exactly why this car is so good. I happen to really like that it looks subtle. I think that's a big part of the appeal of a car like a Golf R or an A35 AMG, is that it looks grown up. It's not like a Honda Civic Type R. Why so good to drive then? It's about breadth of ability, really. It is comfortable in everyday use. It's effortless to use around town. It's got a great cabin, plenty of space. So it does all that everyday stuff without any fuss whatsoever. But then when you do eventually reach a proper stretch of B road, it's properly talented. Steering really crisp, super accurate. You can really position the car with it. Four-wheel drive, of course, which just means it's got masses of traction. It never feels adjustable on the throttle like some four-wheel drive cars do. It isn't that type of all-wheel drive system. But it does give you masses of traction, which really comes into its own when it's chucking it down outside like it is today. Crucially, this car has got dynamic chassis control. That's a £800–900 option. It's one you really need to be ticking. And the car's got an individual driving mode, so you can choose exactly which settings you want for the different parameters. So right now I'm in individual mode. I've got the drivetrain turned into race. I've got the steering in normal, that's the middle setting, and I've got the dampers actually, because it's very wet outside and this is quite a bumpy road, I've got the dampers in their softest setting. And like that, the car is almost unstoppable. It's so quick, it's imperious along this road. If you've ever found yourself in convoy with one of these cars in an apparently much more powerful, much more dedicated sports car, you'll know that these things are really hard to shake. They just stick to your bumper. It's so impressive. Coming out of there, foot down, third gear, no wheel spin whatsoever, just bang. It's such a supremely capable car. Over this bumpy road with the dampers in their softest setting, you just feel the chassis. It's fluid, it's pliant. Each corner is searching for grip. You feel the tyre being pressed hard into the road so that it claws big grip out of the surface. This car has got an optional Akrapovic exhaust. £3,000 that costs. But it does sound pretty good. It's quite raspy and zippy at the top end. And then sometimes on the overrun you get those pops and crackles. So it's a really good drivetrain. DSG box. Do you know, I've always said that the DSG box suits this car more than the manual ever did. So I don't mind that it's DSG only now. I think that's a good move. Yeah. This is one of those cars that just ticks every box, answers whatever question you can ask of it. And on a day like today, there aren't many cars, I have to say, that would be substantially quicker along this road. Bumpy, wet, slippery, but this thing just holds on so well. So that's why, all of those reasons explain why the Golf R for a good half decade has been the go-to, the definitive everyday hot hatch. This is the car then that the new Mercedes-AMG A35 has got to try and trump. Can it do it? So can the A35 AMG finally dethrone that Golf R? Is this Mercedes the car to finally topple the Golf, which has been at the top of the everyday hot hatch class for so long? When you start comparing these two cars, it's really difficult to overlook the A35's cabin. Have a look at this cockpit. It's really impressive. Now, there's nothing particularly wrong with the Golf's cabin. In the hot hatch class, it's still one of the best, but it is made to feel a generation old by this A35's cockpit. In fact, it is a generation old, isn't it? There's a new Mark 8 Golf coming at the end of the year, and presumably that will close the gap to this A-Class in terms of how modern it feels. But for now, the gulf between the two cars, between the two cockpits, is massive. It really is. So this Mercedes cabin is dominated by these two massive screens here that take up almost 2/3 of the width of the cabin, and they're beautifully rendered. This one here is a touchscreen, works really well, or you can use the trackpad down here to navigate, and that works just as well. I don't particularly love the look of the steering wheel with these very fat spars here, but once you get used to how all these buttons work, it just becomes really intuitive. This really is the most impressive cockpit in the hot hatch sector at the moment. But really, we only care how this thing actually drives. One of the first things you notice when you jump into the A35 is the sound of the engine. Even though that Golf has got £3,000 worth of trick exhaust system on it, this A35 does sound much better. There's a rottiness, there's a hard edge to the exhaust note that you don't get in the VW, which I really like. But in terms of efficacy, so how effective the engine, how effective the transmission is in this car, I don't think you can really separate it from the Golf Rs. They're both very good. Like that VW, this A35 has got a responsive, energetic turbo engine, lots of power and torque, and then instant gear shifts as well. So the only way you can separate the two powertrains as a whole is that this Mercedes has got a more tuneful, more interesting soundtrack. By the slimmest margin, by a hair's breadth, you have to give it to the A35. What about ride and handling, dynamics? What about the chassis? It's a little bit frustrating that this A35 doesn't have adaptive dampers. You can get them on this car. That Golf has got them. On this A35 they cost about £700, so similar money to what you're paying on the Golf. Across this very bumpy stretch of road, that VW feels much better sorted. It's just calmer, smoother, more settled along here. So whereas this car is bouncing and skipping about quite a lot, the VW is settled and composed. I'm sure you could put that right in the A35 by just ticking that box for adaptive dampers. It's a bit of a no-brainer, really. But when the road does smooth out a little bit, the Golf loses its advantage, and then it's almost impossible to separate the two. It's similar to the powertrain. They're so close that you're just looking for the tiniest details, the tiniest margins to find one that you prefer. Like that Golf, this A35 in wet conditions just feels so secure. The grip is so transparent, you're not left guessing at all. and the traction is massive. The four-wheel drive system works in a very similar way. So again, this car doesn't have any adjustability on the throttle really. You can't make it slide. Instead, you've just got really good traction. I don't think there's anything between the two cars in terms of point-to-point pace. Possibly this Mercedes has just got a little bit of an edge in terms of agility, in terms of response. It's not much in it. The brakes on this car are hot now. We've just done a quick run downhill and the pedal is going long and they're losing just a little bit of bite. It didn't happen in the VW. Over the very bumpy roads, the VW does have an advantage. That might just be down to the adaptive dampers. On these smooth roads, it's not just that they're difficult to separate, they actually feel very similar to drive. That's to be expected, I suppose, isn't it? They've got more or less the same mechanical makeup. There isn't anything significant about the way these two cars drive that says one is much better than the other. But we need to give you a definitive answer. I'm not letting you leave this video without having a proper answer to the question, which car is better, the Golf R or the A35? And I think the only way I can arrive at a conclusion there is to think of it like this. Which way would my own money go? This is one of the tightest twin tests I've been involved in for a very long time. Only by driving the two cars much more throughout the day, jumping from one to the other, could I find any meaningful way to separate them. The Mercedes feels like it's worth £10,000 more, but if it was my money, I would still be going to the Volkswagen dealership. The Golf R is just a little sweeter and a touch lighter on its feet along a B road. It's steering fractionally better. So the Golf R remains the definitive everyday hot hatch. Now BMW, what have you and the new M135i got? We'll bring you an answer to that as soon as we can. Thank you for watching. Please remember to tap the thumbs up button, comment below and subscribe to the PistonHeads YouTube channel.